This video is about psychology and Indigenous people, and we've done some really bad stuff there. I'm going to tell you how psychology is implicated in such things as the stolen generation, but also assisted in genocide. So yeah, all that coming up. So our focus is on Indigenous Australians and what psychology's been saying about them. And I'm talking here about Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, but mostly I'll talk about Aboriginal people because that has been the focus of much of the literature I'm drawing on. Oh, and no, Indigenous doesn't include Pauline Hanson.
And I'm Indigenous.
He's Indigenous?
Yes, I am. I was born here. Where's my land if it's not Australia?
England?
Sorry, Pauline. I think you're confusing Indigenous with indignant, or maybe ignorant. Apologies to Pauline fans out there. Now first we need to go back to World War II and take a look at the theory of racial hybridity. Here was the view that one racial group is superior to another and that any mixing of those groups, i.e. through sexual reproduction, could damage the gene pool of the superior group. Essentially, these are the ideas contained in Hitler's Mein Kampf and led to the policies in Nazi Germany of racial hygiene. And that led to the Holocaust. This pogrom of segregation and extermination of disabled people, Jewish people, gay people, Romani people, amongst others, was propped up by the research findings of psychologists who thought it legitimate and appropriate and worthwhile to find empirical data to support the theory of racial hybridity. Now, the work by psychologists and psychiatrists into eugenics was particularly influential on Nazi ideology. And here is a rather horrific example, the book by Karl Binding, who was a jurist, and Alfred Hoch, who was a psychiatrist. It was published in 1920. The book was called Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Living. The book argued that for the good of society, certain people should be ethically killed, and those people they were talking about were people diagnosed as mentally ill. Now, this book set the groundwork for what eventually became the Holocaust as we know it. And at that time, and perhaps still true today, psychologists and psychiatrists didn't feel they had a moral responsibility over how their research and writings might be used. Indeed, under the Third Reich, psychologists became increasingly opportunistic and were happily working away to support Nazi ideology in their research. Those psychologists were rewarded for their work through gaining social status, such as through promotion, but also through gaining access to research funding. Again, thinking back to our videos on Milgram, perhaps what we can understand is happening here was a concern for doing a technically good job rather than a morally good job. You know, those psychologists were doing what you were doing as students. They were following instructions, designing technically proficient experiments, making sure that their research reports were well written, well formatted. They answered the research questions that the Nazi government was seeking to answer. Here are a few psychologists whose work informed the Nazi policy on racial hygiene. This work warned of the supposed dangers of interbreeding. So we have Paul Broca. We named a bit of the brain after him. He stated that mixed races were inferior to pure races. We have Francis Galton, who stated pure races were more intelligent than mixed races. And we have Gustave Le Bon, who we mentioned in one of the Milgram videos. He felt it useful to classify racial groups into primitive, inferior, average and superior. And you guessed it, white people were the superior group and black people were the inferior group. Can you hear the lorikeets? Had a lot of noisy lorikeets. The joys of nature. We also had Herbert Spencer, and he advised against racial interbreeding, and Stanley Hall, who viewed the white race as superior. Clearly, as a member of the white race, I'm showing lack of superiority here. Now, of course, This was all a long time ago, and that was perhaps how a lot of people thought at that time. So same counter-argument we first considered in relation to the sexist views in psychology about women. Well, we can bring it a bit more up to date and look at South Africa during the time of apartheid. There, the vast majority of psychologists in South Africa believed in apartheid ideology, and some were very active in developing apartheid policy. Remember, apartheid is the system where white and black people are segregated in society. Black-only areas, white-only areas, and so on. And psychologist Jan Smuts was Prime Minister of South Africa during the Second World War, and Smuts believed that South Africa should be a white man's country. He passed the first piece of legislation which separated white and black areas, and in 1920 the Native Urban Areas Act, which laid down the principle of residential segregation in urban areas. Hendrik Hervert, a professor of psychology at the University of Stellenbosch, became Prime Minister in 1958, and he enacted some of the most horrendous apartheid laws in the country. Laws that categorised all citizens by race and forced blacks and other groups to move to slums. Other academic psychologists played a large role in propping up apartheid as well, producing pseudoscience to support segregationist theories, largely through perpetuating eugenics theory. But these psychologists didn't consider themselves racist. They believed their work was value-free and scientific. Again, they would state that they were not responsible or even concerned about how the politicians and others were using their research. And bringing it back to home, let's look at the eugenic policy in Australia. Restricting non-white immigration to Australia was one of the first acts passed by Australian Federation in 1901, and it was largely encouraged by the eugenics research coming from, among others, psychologists in Europe that promoted the idea that white European was racially superior to all other races. It's become known as the White Australia policy. Now, a prominent feature of that policy was the laws authorising the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families. These children are known as the stolen generations. And this practice went on from 1871 right up until 1965. The dismantling of the white Australian policy started in 1949, but progress in dismantling it was slow. Its removal was largely in response to a collapse in European colonialism, where Australia found itself needing to develop more positive relationships with its surrounding Asian nations. It was also an adjustment in line with changing social attitudes around race and ethnicity that was happening in the 1950s and 1960s. It wasn't until 1973 that the new Whitlam government took the final steps to remove race as a factor in Australia's immigration provisions. And in spite of the changes to the statutes, Australia effectively remained white on the immigration front until around 1975, when the implications of the new policy were tested by the refugee crisis in the wake of the Vietnam War. And we started to see Australia open its door, really, for the first time to non-white people. Now, curiously, you don't hear much when you study psychology in Australia about psychology's involvement in this White Australia policy, but it's there. It was in the first half of the 20th century that psychology started to develop as a major discipline in Australia at the same time of the implementation of the White Australia policy. And it's not coincidental that early on in Australia psychology began focusing on the psychological characteristics of Indigenous Australians. Psychologists started using the tools of psychometrics to examine the mental capacity of Aboriginal people. And early research found no difference between Aboriginal and white people, but psychology was dissatisfied with these findings and tried again. It's really clear that psychology was focused on constructing a scientific case, however spuriously, to argue how Aboriginal people were inferior to white people, and we still live with the legacy of that work today. Now, a prominent example of this is the work of Stanley Porteous, who published widely, and his main premise was that Aboriginal people were mentally inferior. And psychologists were also involved, in the administration of the White Australia policy. They were measuring the intelligence of Aboriginals so that decisions could be made as to their detainment in missions and so on. The intelligence tests were constructed with a clear bias against Indigenous people. They were constructed in a way that predetermined Aboriginal people were stupid. Now, by the 1940s, Aboriginals were an object of inquiry for Australian psychology. And at that time, Australian psychology was fully immersed in the theory of eugenics. Now let's just stop a minute and remind ourselves of the history of Australia. So approximately 60,000 years ago, Aboriginals settled in Australia. And in 1788, the first fleet arrives in Australia from Great Britain. More land, from more land. And the first fleet arrived to establish a penal colony. The colonisation was based on the premise that the land belonged to no one. It's called terra nullius. Now, estimates of Aboriginal population at that time range from around 300,000 to 1 million, and there were around 250 Indigenous languages in use. By the 1920s, there were believed to be only 60,000 Aboriginal people left in Australia. Now that's the sign that indicates that what we're talking about here is a genocide against Indigenous people in Australia, enacted over 200 years. Indeed, it's hard to think about what happened to Aboriginal people in terms other than genocide when we look at the drastic reduction in the size of the population. Zygmunt Bauman gives us a useful way of thinking about how genocide happens. It happens when we lose our moral concerns about violent atrocities being committed against a large group of people. And loss of moral concern happens when three conditions are met. First, the violence is authorised by official orders coming from the legally entitled quarters. Here, the politicians argue that it should happen. Second, actions are routinized by rule-governed practices and exact specification of roles. And here, bureaucratic structures are set up to enable it to happen. Systems that put social distance between those who do the harm and those who are harmed. And third, the victims of the violence are dehumanized by ideological definitions and indoctrinations. Here, social categories, social identities and so on are constructed and employed to categorize certain people in certain ways, usually into categories of the good people and the bad people. And psychology is one of the key players in relation to condition free. As such, psychology has functioned to enable genocide to happen by being a key institution that's fulfilled condition free. And it was a key institution that ensured social policies focused on eradicating Aboriginal people from Australia, and that practice could be sustained over 2 centuries. So psychology gave a road clear sign for genocide to occur whenever politicians argued for it to happen and when the administrative systems provided the means by which it could happen. Now, whether you can stomach this idea that psychology has been active in systems that committed atrocities towards Indigenous people, we can think of a less extreme version of this concern, and that is the inaction of psychology in the face of atrocities being committed against Indigenous people still to this day. Now, this quote is important. The failure of psychology to speak out on the forced removal of Indigenous children highlights a more significant issue in this history. Psychology as a profession has failed to actively engage in policy analysis and formulation or to undertake any significant advocacy role on the behalf of Indigenous Australians. Psychologists on the whole have failed to use psychological models and frameworks to provide policymakers, professional staff and Indigenous communities with any sustained analysis of the psychological consequences of colonisation, the impacts of these consequences on Indigenous communities today, and understanding the generational trauma that has been inflicted upon Aboriginal people, in which psychology has itself been complicit. And of course we have Hans Eysenck. He was one of the key figures in psychology who was determined to show how black people are genetically inferior to whites when it comes to intelligence. This is not the only example of racist practices in psychology. Michael Billig has written an excellent analysis of psychology's racism. It's well worth a read. And it's an important read because we need to be aware that racist practices still continue in psychology. It didn't stop with Hans Eysenck. Now here are a few books from the 1990s and early noughties. In The G Factor, Chris Brand claims that genetic component in intelligence outweighs environmental influences and repeats the view that blacks in the United States obtain lower average IQs than whites. And you can also find similarly racist research in the book by Richard Lynn, who links race, IQ and wealth. And you can hear people like Jordan Peterson perpetuating these ideas today. This is not about the individual views of particular psychologists, and it's not about demonizing those individual psychologists as somehow bad people. Whilst it's fun, to have a freak show with all of these psychologists from the past and present lined up with all their racist views, we need to look beyond those individuals. To turn back to Milgram's experiment, we need to consider how we're not talking about a group of bad psychologists doing some very bad things, but we're looking at how the nature of psychology allows those bad things to happen, how it functions such that ordinary psychologists trying to acquit themselves well of their ordinary duties as psychologists end up doing some very bad things, and to point to how there is a very real danger that you as psychologists could end up doing very bad things. So we've got to pay attention to this. We don't want that to happen, do we? And it's because they mostly do these bad things in the name of science and in the name of truth. So chew over those ideas. Let's get a bit of discussion going. And that's all for me for now. So that was hard going, wasn't it? That was pretty heavy. So till next time. Ta-da.